Welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast. My name is Jonathan, and today we're doing something a little different as we are interviewing Glen Longwell on his book, The Dead Letters, and why we kind of had this conversation in the first place, or the reason why we ended up discussing this idea of talking about this book is because, I guess a few months ago now, not a couple of months ago, a few months ago now, they were very kind and had me on their podcast, and we had a long chat about a number of different things, and one of the things that we discussed a bit was your book, and I think we had a brief discussion kind of where some of the ideas and the originating process was, and one of the things that kind of came across was, at least from my perspective, as you had been talking about it being a kind of originating out of like Roman Britain. Is that correct?
Yeah, most of it, down to this, a lot of it actually is just Welsh from like the Roman Britain era, and then I do one of the peoples in my series that they do like a high king structure, which is very similar to how the Welsh and the Scots did it after the Romans left.
Right.
And
Uh,
I kind of built it around that, at least for the initial governmental structure of the mountain people.
right. And I guess just for those unfamiliar with the book, if you could just kind of give us sort of an outline, I guess, of kind of what the book's about.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a dark-ish fantasy novel. I definitely wouldn't recommend reading it if you are faint of heart and don't like profanity, but it's based on a continent in a fantasy world where there are basically three groups of people. There's the Fuertesians, which are like a dominant power that invaded this continent, which is known as Azuela's gift, and they have been bullying on the natives of the land who live in the other half of the continent, which is all mountainous terrain for the most part, and that is known as Lazaris Latemas. And the reason it's called Azuela's gift is they pray to a river god. He is like the only god in their pantheon. But all of there is a pantheon of gods. It's just that not, and they're all in the same pantheon, but not all of the same people recognize the same gods as being as powerful. And for the natives, they are all about the river god, and their high ruling family has been a succession of people who are descended from Azuela, the river god. And the basic gist of the story is the princess of the king, who later names himself emperor of Fuerte. She is married off to the high king of Lazaris Latemas as sort of a peace cow. But as you read in through the book, you realize that it's just filled with people scheming and scamming. And she finds herself basically adopting these people's culture and falling in love with it in many ways. And if that doesn't grab your attention, people ride bears into battle. So, but
Right. Okay.
there's
Um,
I was gonna say there's also a rather non-conventional naming style pattern that I adopted for the natives of Lazaris Latemas. They try to have like a Z and Zwale or some form of Azuela's name in their name. So a lot of the kings have similar names because like the High King is Loziel, then there's Lonez, and then there's Loles. So it serves a purpose, but a few readers have told me that they had to keep flipping back to remember who is who. So I think if I re-release it, I will be putting a chart to make it a little simpler.
right. Right. So what? I guess one question I'd ask, kind of, what inspired you to look at this kind of structure and this kind of um, storyline? I guess what stories
Well,
or history or whatever inspired that thought?
it's burned from a few different things. I mean, one, I've always been a huge history fan. I especially love the history of the island of Britain. And when I was younger and I was in college, I was a big English history major. And then as I kind of got more and more into the Welsh history, I thought, like, wow, this is this is really interesting stuff prior to them just being swallowed by England, and even to an extent afterwards. But the what I thought really jumped out at me was the pre-Roman Britons, the Dark Ages, and then just the fighting nature that they possessed when Rome invaded, and then later when the Angles and Saxons and the Jutes came over, or at least some of them fought. That's obviously a matter of a lot of debate these days.
Yeah.
And I liked that a lot. And, I have Welsh and Irish and Scottish ancestry. So that, to that degree, I kind of connected with it.
Right.
And then, obviously, I don't know if you're familiar, but there was a cartoon in the 90s by Greg Weisman called Gargoyles.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And they had Macbeth as one of their main characters. And they got really into the Scottish structure, or at least as much as what a children's cartoon would, with the High Kings and the clans and this and that. And I really thought that was kind of cool. And then when I was reading the Warlord trilogy by Bernard Cornwell, which is a trilogy he wrote of historical fiction based around King Arthur, and so it's got a lot of the classic bits of the Caradoc and Lancelot and all those guys are in there. He's got his knights, but they're kings in this, and Arthur was essentially the reigning high king throughout this trilogy. And I read that maybe about 5 years ago now, and that's kind of what gave me the base structure for when I sat down and finally started writing the Dead Letters, because I've been working on the idea since high school, but I really didn't know where I wanted to take it, and I just had a bunch of like silly short stories that I eventually as I started writing it and mapping out how I wanted the story to go, I was able to include a lot of the aspects that I had learned and thought of throughout the years. And a lot of writing the book involved researching Welsh and Scottish history to an extent that I did not know I had in me before attempting.
Right. Okay. And I guess from our listener's standpoint, what drew you? I guess specifically, which stories or which part of Welsh history might have been sort of the things that you kind of focused in on. I know you mentioned the Arthurian legends, but was there other stories?
Yeah, I mean, I mixed it around a lot. I actually, for all intents and purposes, the main character, Rebecca, a lot of her story was inspired to me by Boudica, or the Boudica, or Boudicca. I don't know what, you know.
Boudica's probably the correct way to say it. Yeah.
I've always thought Boudicca sounded too Romanized. Actually, we talked about that in last week's episode.
Right.
Um, Much like I always thought Caractacus or whatever sounded like that couldn't have been his Roma or his British name.
Right.
But yeah, so she was. I've always thought she was a fascinating character since I knew who she was, and so I knew when I started writing this that I wanted to have a strong female protagonist. And once I kind of settled on Welsh as being my underlying theme, I knew that was the one that I was gonna try to channel as much as possible. And then other than that, it's not a lot of it is just kind of taking like my favorite bits in history and throwing them in there. Like I do, there's a lot of war bowmen. There's a man that he conquers he's a usurper, which is just based on any time from when the Danes were invading, when everybody was just usurping and supplanting kings left and right. And he uses war bowmen, which is at this point like nobody else has seen them. And that's the English military, but a lot of the ones that they employed were Welsh because that was how the peasants hunted.
Yep. Yep. No, I get what you're saying. Now, did you? Okay, so uh, I know from reading the book, it's a kind of a series of it feels almost like it starts out as sort of an Indiana Jones type adventure initially, where you have sort of an archaeologist and finding these letters effectively. Is this something that you had plotted out as sort of the idea of how it would begin, and sort of from the perspective of this archaeologist finding this information?
Yeah, I just thought it would be really cool to do something like that. And I had just got done reading about them discovering a bunch of new hill forts and some stuff in the hill forts. And I had read about this farmer that found, I think they were spearheads from like the maybe 500s or 400s or whatever that belong, or no, I'm sorry, from right around the Roman invasion, and he didn't know what they were, obviously, and I guess that's just things that people find out in farms out there in the country of England and Wales, and I thought that was kind of cool, and so I kind of went from there because I'm glad you read it, uh-huh. And a lot of what the um, he was doing when he was out there was talking to the locals because that I figured was going to be the best way to kind of incorporate those cool little things that I had read about, like with people just finding it in their backyard.
Hmm.
And as and making him the archaeologist seemed the best way because I really wanted to write something that worked in layers because he comes in with a broad understanding of what he's going to get, but in reality he couldn't be more wrong in what he thought to what he eventually learns. And I also had an idea of just kind of writing somebody who's so in love with their work that they kind of start to lose their sanity because everything is working against them. And
Right.
so that's, I decided I was going to write it with him having like a prologue, an epilogue, and an interlude, and I was going to implement that in all three of the books that I'm going to work on so that he has his own storyline going as well, and it kind of keeps you on where the current status of the kingdom is, and then that way it allows the reader to fill in the gaps because the story that we're going to be covering, the Rebecca story, is not the end to lead where he is, but there's going to be some, just like in real history, you have some stuff that you're very confident happened, and then there's some fuzzy areas, and then you have some firsthand accounts 200 years later to fill it in.
Right. Right. Yeah, we're living that message right now in the Welsh History podcast because a lot of our source material ends up being separated from the original stories by, in some cases, hundreds of years, and you sort of have to live with that from a historical perspective and hope it's right, but sometimes it
Right.
gets proven inaccurate.
Yeah,
uh, because archaeologists find things which kind of point to different conclusions. Sometimes the archaeology can mislead you too, because you can find things in the ground that say one thing, but then as you sort of piece things together, it may change over time, obviously, as different perspectives and different understandings come about. I know one thing we've talked about a little bit is the idea that you will see archaeologists insisting that someone's a woman or a man because of the width of their hip or the way their orbital bone might be or various things to do with their teeth. And over the years, there becomes more and more question about how reliable those kind of things are. And so just because someone has a narrow hip doesn't necessarily make them a man or a woman. And
right.
so you have those kind of questions now because the assumption that you get in archaeology previously was based on how people were buried. And a lot of times back in those days before Christianity came along, people were buried with things. And so we just assumed based on, okay, well, this one person has narrow hips. They're buried with what looks like knitting needles and brooches and things like that. They must obviously be a woman until they find something else that points out that this might be a man. And now all of a sudden you've got a very confusing message under the ground. So even in archaeology, nothing's straightforward. Nothing's as simple as it seems. So yeah, I think having a little gray area is always good in your storyline. So with that, I guess the other question I should ask is which sort of like what authors or stylistically kind of I know reading it was a little different, at least initially, from what I expected. Is that because something you kind of thought about, or is it something that you've been inspired by other people's writings?
Well, the initial structure, you know, actually a lot of it was from when I was reading A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin, because he has his chapters very similar to the at least broad format of my own, where it's each character has their own chapter, And I liked that because I thought it was a good way of, especially for what I was trying to do with the gray area, I thought it'd be a good way of kind of giving you the story and the events that are happening, but you as the reader are forced to decide who's good, who's not good, who you like, who you don't like. And if the person that's telling you, if the narrator is reliable or if it's biased, which it obviously is almost always biased. And then you kind of have to read through the lines of the chapter to see like how much of what they're telling you is accurate and how much is just them being, full of themselves or too hard on themselves or whatever.
Right. Right.
And so that was, yeah, that to me, I just thought that if I could figure out a way to combine what I liked about his writing style to my own, it would work out well. And I also liked, I don't know if you noticed it, but the first chapter for all the characters is just labeled as what their book was, whether it was the sign on the front or the color or something that separated it from the rest, because it's supposed to kind of be like as if he were compiling this for his own use. So you're looking at it basically through his own notes. So even what you're reading is theoretically the sifted versions of what he's keeping.
Right. Right. Yeah, that did come across. I was picking that up as I was looking at it, and I had noticed as it went along kind of how the structure was built. So I appreciated that. Yeah, it did give it a little bit of cohesion.
Well, thank you.
And okay, so I guess another question I would ask at this stage is how long did it take you to write?
Well, it took me about a year to write the book, and then about another year to edit and fine tune it, just because my writing method, at least for that one, I hadn't really. I'd written short stories and I'd written this and that, but I'd never tried to sit down and write an entire novel, or at least not successfully. So when I wrote it, I just kind of wrote it. I wrote the vibe that I was trying to get across for each character in the story, and then when I went through and read it, I realized there was however many grammatical errors and spelling errors, and maybe I harped too much on one character being angry, and I had to. There was a couple times where I realized that like I made Artzel, who is one of my favorite characters to write, just incredibly difficult to like. So
Right.
I kind of had to go through and change some stuff around. And I only just recently found out that the software that I use to um, take it from a Word document and make it an ebook decided that it wanted to make its own changes on a few, like all of the words with apostrophes ended up with quotation marks. So I thought that was interesting. That was not a stylistic choice.
Right. Okay. All right. Fair enough. Um, that can, yeah. Having worked with PDF makers and things like that in the past, I understand and sympathize. So, when you are, I guess, working on this, did you always plan for it to stretch into a series of books? Was it something where you thought, I have one story to tell, and then it kind of came about, you thought, no, there's more to add? Or was it always kind of a thing where you thought, okay, I'm going to write multiple stories out of this, and they're going to stretch to different books and different ideas?
Well, it I decided to make this a trilogy about halfway through writing the first one. What I had initially done, like I said, when I started working on this in high school, just as a way to kind of when I was alone, I would write short stories, and I ended up building this universe through those. And obviously, the high school version of it I tweaked because it was crap, but that was the base structure for what I ended up. So I knew that I was going to. I've always written in this world here in some way or another. But when I decided on the story that I really wanted to tell and kind of had it mapped out, at least in my head, and knew the characters, I was originally thinking, I'll just write this in one book and see how it goes. And I got about halfway through where I wanted the story for the first, for what became the first book, and I was looking at it, and I was like, wow, this is already like 50,000 words, and I'm not, I'm maybe halfway done. And so then I kind of looked at it again with my buddy who actually helped me edit it out, and I paid him in Mediterranean wrap, so you can't beat that price. But when I told him where I wanted the story to go ultimately, and because I like to leave my characters with enough room to breathe and kind of change and alter the story as they go, because I like to have a firm beginning, middle, and end, but there's a lot of flexibility in between where maybe the who does it can change based on how the characters end up evolving throughout the story. And when we were having our meeting, I realized like, well, two books is possible, but I really have an idea for how I want the story to end, and to do it justice, I think I would need to do either like, that would be like a 500-bit part of the second book, or maybe I should just make it a third book. So at this point, we're looking at a trilogy, but depending on what happens, it may end up being a tetralogy.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, okay. So the other, I guess, kind of the final question, I guess I would ask at this stage is, do you, and this is more from the standpoint of my other podcast that we do, but is this something that came out of role playing that you were doing, or is this just something that came out of your reading of different stories or different, like the fantasy genre? I know a lot of people get influenced by D&D and other games that they've played in the past. So was this something that kind of came about because of that, or is that just not related at all?
No, actually, yeah, when I was 15 is when I started Dungeons and Dragons, and we were playing Ravenloft,
Right?
and it was my uncle who got me into it, and he was obviously about 15 years older than me. And what inspired me to write in fantasy at all was just sitting there before I even made a character and watching their DM, whose name was Rayton. And he went so above and beyond of what a DM normally would do. He had a map that he had it all mapped out. He had dialogues written for the characters that he was going to be doing. Not that he was a regular, but for whoever they met was obviously him. And the one I was there was the first one. They had met like a big boss of some sort. I don't remember, but they ended up with 25-minute dialogue and just kind of chatting. And I was like, wow, this is like, I was riveted, and I had no former experience with Dungeons and Dragons at that point. And that's when I knew that alone was something I wanted to get involved in. Though, admittedly, it has been very hard to find a steady group of people that also have a similar schedule to your own that will do it. Um,
I know that one.
but that's what made me, or at least kind of my first taste into really, really liking fantasy, because I had only read Tolkien at that point. I wasn't super into the genre in any sense. And that kind of opened that door. And I'd already written a couple short stories that I guess would be considered fantasy or just regular nonfiction. And that kind of opened the door to where like fantasy is a whole world where I can literally be a god. And like, well, now unicorns are here because why not? And magic can exist. So that was, for as a writer, that was very appealing. And I also played the game. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Pendragon.
I know a little bit about it, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really fun game if you can get people, because that's done over generations. You're almost always human, and it's just like any other game where you have classes and warriors and barbarians and this and that, but you can start off as one character, and by the time that the full campaign ends, or you guys finish it up, you could be 7 generations into that character's family. And that's why it's so important to have a family in that game, or else you just have to create a new character, because people die left and right, and you'll sometimes end up playing two characters because your son will be of an age and you want to bring him along, because any D2 role could be your last.
Right.
uh, and so that, as well as, like I said, just reading into real history and historical fiction, was a pretty big way in how I knew I wanted to set up my world. Because even though I wanted it fantasy, I wanted it to seem like something that could only happen in a fantasy world. I mean, obviously, there's exceptions, because there's dog people and there's people riding bears into battle. but for the overall like story, I wanted it to be something that was like, yeah, this is these people are believable, and this is relatively in the realm of what is possible, and some of it seems fantastical, but there's also a lot of it also has a rational explanation. And I mean, so that was the biggest thing, as well as I don't know if you're familiar with her work. MC Scott, she wrote a tetralogy about the Boudica, and while reading that, I kind of got a real feel for how I wanted to write certain scenes and how I wanted to kind of depict my main character, Rebecca. I didn't want to just. I feel like writing for a woman is always really difficult for any writer, or writing of the opposite gender, I should say, at least believably.
Right.
So when I read hers, I thought it was, a really good chance to kind of see how a woman would write a strong woman. And so I didn't copy her style, but I certainly tried.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. Awesome. Well, I think with that, we're going to end for today, but I just wanted to give you a chance to plug various things, including your book and, of course, the podcast.
Absolutely, yes. The book is The Dead Letters by D.G. Longwell. It is only available through Amazon on the Kindle ebook. So if you have the Kindle app or you own a Kindle, you can download it. It is $3.99 typically. However, I am planning on putting it for free here in about the next month when Amazon gives me the option to do that once more. The podcast that I host is called The Glen and Dean Show, and it is my co-host, Dean Zarba, who owns all the gear and is also a comedian like myself in the Cleveland area. We like to get on an array of guests, from history podcasters such as yourself, to authors, to other comedians. And that is available on iTunes or glenanddean.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Glen Longwell 89, or Facebook is just Glen Longwell, and I will be the one doing stand up as my background. I don't know if there's a lot of others. I'm from Avon Lake, Ohio, which is in the Cleveland area. So that if that helps you find me, don't stalk me though, please. And yeah, that is all I got. We're in the midst of working on our own history podcast, so if you want to stay up to tune on that, you can follow the Glen and Dean Show at Glen and Dean Show on Twitter, or Glen and Dean Show on Facebook.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Glenn. I appreciate you coming along for today, and I appreciate your time.
I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
No problem. And as always, everyone, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And as well, you can find all the things that we do at distractionsmedia.com. And next week, we're going to dive right into the 7th century as we discuss the political machinations of various Welsh kingdoms against the Saxons and Anglicans in that era. Until next time, everyone, take care. Bye.
This has been a Distractions Media production. For more information, you can check out everything we do at distractionsmedia.com.